On August 7th, 1721, nearly a year after being forced out of the Boston Gazette, James Franklin released the New England Courant. He proudly advertised it as the first newspaper published without authority. Like the first paper published in 1690, James was willing to take the risk to print and publish work that had not been approved by the Massachusetts Council. It's not known if he knew about that paper or that it was closed after one issue, with its publisher being jailed. If he did, this act only makes what he did braver. What James would have been aware of was the nature of the Puritans who had come to New England and were influential in running the colony. On one hand, the Puritans were great advocates of the printing press. A core tenet of their beliefs were that people needed to read the Bible on their own or form their own prayer groups. This was good news for someone in the printing business, as that meant in order to read, a basic education was required, and this led to more readers who wanted more books and more publications. So important was printing to the Puritans that they had their first press in Cambridge by 1638, just 18 years after the Mayflower set sail. On the other hand, the moral codes of the Puritans were very strict, which in turn led to strict laws. For example, fining people for not attending church on Sunday, determining what people could wear, requiring everyone to pay taxes to the church even if they were dissenters. The government was also strict, and criticizing them could be charged as seditious libel, and punished with fines, branding, or time in the pillory. Blasphemy could be punished by death. It was the Puritans and the libel laws that James intended to challenge, and he chose none other than Cotton Mather in the first issue of the New England Courant. The Mather family had a long history in the formation of Puritan New England. Cotton's father, Increase, was minister at the Old North Church and was the 6th president of Harvard College. Cotton would also attend Harvard and become a minister, and before his death, he would publish over 350 works in his life. The Magnalia Christi Americana, or the Glorious Works of Christ in America, was the work he would be known for most in his lifetime. It chronicled the religious history of the Massachusetts Bay Colony from 1620 to 1698. But that's not what posterity would remember him for. Cotton Mather would publish memorable providences relating to witchcrafts and possessions in 1689. A few years later, when the Salem witch trials would start, Mather would defend court cases that would see 19 people killed for witchcraft when he published Wonders of the Invisible World the following year. Hawthorne would later write about Cotton Mather at Salem, stating he was the chief agent of the mischief. While apprenticing in London, James likely came across the newspaper The Spectator, which would be famous for trying to reform English society and manners. Its creator, Joseph Addison, would later go on to write George Washington's favorite play, Cato. It was this newspaper that James bonded over with his two friends, John Checkley and William Douglas. John Checkley was one of Boston's most radical Anglicans, and James chose him to introduce the Courant to the world. Checkley mimicked the first entry in The Spectator written by Addison, and he states, "I'll immediately stop short and give my gentle reader some account of my person and my rare endowments. Therefore, I hope no one will hereafter object against my soaring now and then with the grave wits of the age. But if they should tell me that I am not yet fit nor worthy to keep company with such illustrious sages, for my beard doesn't yet reach down to my girdle, I shall make them no other answer than this: Barba non facit philosophum. Translation: a beard does not make a philosopher. He concludes his introduction with, "This paper will be published once a fortnight, and out of mere kindness to my brother writers, I intend now and then to be like them, very, very dull. After Checkley's grand introduction and conclusion where he insulted the other two papers in Boston, James set his sights on Cotton Mather, but he needed an issue with which to battle. As fate would have it, that issue would come from the West Indies on board the HMS Seahorse, a smallpox epidemic. This was not Cotton Mather's first experience with the disease. During a 1703 outbreak, 3 of his children had contracted it. Before he became a minister, Mather had studied to become a physician, and he worried what would happen if the disease would ever come back. In 1715, Cotton Mather heard about the practice of inoculation from his slave Onesimus. To verify this, Mather would borrow Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society from Dr. William Douglas, the only person in Boston who likely had a copy. He would read about another physician's work, Emmanuel Timony, who had witnessed a similar procedure while serving as the British ambassador in Turkey. When the disease struck again, Mather sent letters to the 10 practicing doctors in Boston, only one of whom had a medical degree, telling them about how a physician could take dried pus from smallpox patients and scrape some of it onto the skin of a healthy person. That person would only contract a mild case, but would be immune to the disease forever. One doctor would reply to Mather's, Zabdiel Boylston, who was considered a second-rate doctor at the time. He would try the inoculation process Mather had suggested with his young son, his slave, and his slave's young son. Just shy of a week later, they finally started showing signs of smallpox, but it was in a weakened form. All of them would survive the procedure. Boylston and Mather were greatly encouraged, but when Boston heard, they were shocked. Boylston would be brought before the council, his ally Cotton Mather nowhere to be found, and he would be reprimanded and told not to do the procedure again. Despite this, Boylston would persist, and Mather would continue to encourage him. It is these events that inspired the second article in James Franklin's first current that attacked both the inoculators. Ironically, this would be written by Dr. William Douglas, the man who lent the book Mather used as a medical reference for the procedure. Douglas proceeded to attack inoculations in the first issue, being entirely new, not in the least vouched or recommended, being merely published in the Philosophic Transactions by way of amusement from Britain, though it came to us via London from the Turks, and by a strong viva voce evidence, was proved to be a fatal and dangerous consequence. We would then continue the attack on Mather. They set up for judges of a man's qualifications in the practice of physic, very lavishly bestowed all the fulsome commonplace of quack advertisements. One would think they meant some romantic character, something beyond that of Candid Sydenham, the sagacious Radcliffe, or the celebrated Mead. They might indeed, in respect of his moral and religious qualification, which lay properly under their cognizance, that he was a modest, humble man, a man of continency, probity, etc. And so it came to be that James Franklin, the man with the progressive idea for a free press, would print the advocacy against inoculation. And he would be doing this against the man, Cotton Mather, whose reputation after his death would mostly be defined by his instigation and then later defense of the Salem witch trials. Inoculation would be modernized by vaccination later in the 18th century, and smallpox would be eradicated in the second half of the 20th century, with no new human cases occurring after 1977. Cotton himself would write to the Boston Gazette about the article, calling it notorious, scandalous paper called The Courant, full freighted with nonsense, unmanliness, raillery. It was perhaps Thomas Walter, Cotton's nephew's response that was most harsh. Walter mocks Checkley with personal attacks. Your harmless lashes, which rather tickled them into a laugh at the awkward flogger, then gall them in the sore place will never displease them. And then he goes on to attack the readers of the Courant. Go on, Monsieur Courant, and prosper. Fear not to please your stupid admirers, which will be an easy task, if you will but consult your own heavy genius, and write in your native style, of which you have been so sharp and discerning as to give us the apt and proper character. Very, very dull. James Franklin would take advantage of these attacks and publish them as a separate piece he called the Anti-Courant. While profiting off the conflict, it would appear James Franklin was also an early subscriber to an adage made famous later by P.T. Barnum: any press is good press. Throughout the rest of 1721, the smallpox debate would continue with both sides attacking each other and inoculation, while the people of Boston continued to suffer under the epidemic. James grew worried about Checkley and Douglas. He would soon ban them from writing in his paper after the third issue. Douglas would be invited back months later, but he hoped to strike a less aggressive tone. Cotton Mather would be preoccupied in the back half of 1721 with his daughter Abigail's pregnancy. Mather was fond of his daughter and called her Nibby. On September 19th, she delivered a daughter, but the birth took its toll on Nibby. As Mather recorded in his diary, she was now in dying circumstances. While attempting to heal his daughter, he took care of his newborn granddaughter. On the afternoon of September 24th, Cotton Mather and his family prepared to baptize the new child. Before she could make it to the church, she died suddenly. Mather declared it an uncommon occurrence. He would try to seek solace in his faith as the tragedies befell him. The day after his granddaughter died, Mather wrote in his diary, "What have I to support me under the pressures which the view of my dying daughter lays upon me? A glorious Christ. He is my life. He is my all. A glorious Christ is carrying my child unto the paradise, where she shall be comforted with enjoyments 10,000 times more comfortable than in any world, which my love to her might have disposed me to have wished for her." The next day, between 10 and 11 in the evening, his daughter Nibby died. Of his 15 children, she would become the 11th he would have to bury. Cotton Mather was surrounded by death during this epidemic. Not only were members of his own family dying, but he would frequently have to visit the dying to perform deathbed prayers. While the Courant was toned down, it still poked fun at Mather, and he would soon have enough. During a chance walk down the street in early November, Mather would run into James Franklin and get involved in a shouting match which many people would hear. A Courant subscriber would write in asking James for the details. He would recall the event a few weeks later in a December 4th issue of the Courant. About 3 weeks since, a certain gentleman stopped me in the street, and with an air of great displeasure attacked me in words to this effect: "You make it your business, in the paper called the Courant, to vilify and abuse the ministers of this town. There are many curses which await those that do so. The Lord will smite through the loins of them that rise up against the Levites. I would have you consider of it. I have no more to say to you." Mather was not amused, and he even noted this in his diary entry for December 9th, 1721. "Warnings are to be given unto the wicked printer and his accomplices, who every week publish a vile paper to lessen and blacken the ministers of the town and render their ministry ineffectual. A wickedness never paralleled anywhere upon the face of the earth." Reporting of the shouting match was likely delayed by something more serious. On November 14th, in the early morning hours, a homemade bomb was thrown into Cotton Mather's home. It failed to detonate, allowing Cotton to read the message attached to it. "Cotton Mather, you dog, damn you. I'll inoculate you with this, with a pox to you." The epidemic would begin to recede in May of 1722. Over 5,000 people contracted the disease, which was about half of Boston at the time. Over 900 would die, effectively killing 10% of the population. Boylston, despite being ordered not to, would inoculate 248 people total, with only 6 dying. Of those 6 deaths, many were already in a weakened or poorer state of health. He, in effect, had brought the mortality rate down to about 2.5%. He would go on to make over £950 from the inoculation, a significant sum of money that would foreshadow future concerns about the cost of healthcare. But for the present, Boylston wrote that he had suffered much in my reputation and in my business too, from the odiums and reflections cast upon me for beginning and carrying on this practice. He would continue to live in fear for his safety and his family's on a daily basis. Towards the end of the smallpox epidemic, James Franklin would receive an anonymous entry into the paper from Silence Dogood. It was common at this time to use pseudonyms when publishing articles or opinion pieces in the newspaper. People might feel safer expressing themselves without it coming back to damage their reputations, businesses, or family. In the case of Silence Dogood, she claimed to be a middle-aged widow, but she was in fact a 16-year-old Benjamin Franklin, who had slipped the entry in disguised handwriting under the floor of his brother's shop. James, unaware that this was his brother, and impressed along with his friends of her writing, published the essay on April 2nd, 1722. Outside of 2 poems James made Benjamin write a year or 2 earlier, this would be his first significant published writing. Silence introduces herself as such. It may not be proper in the first place to inform your readers that I intend once a fortnight to present them, by the help of this paper, with a short epistle which I presume will add somewhat to their entertainment. And since it is observed, and the generality of people nowadays are unwilling either to commend till they are in some measure informed who or what the author of it is, whether he be rich or poor, old or young, a scholar or a leather-aproned man, and give their opinion of the performance according to the knowledge which they have of the author's circumstances, it may not be amiss to begin with a short account of my past life and present condition, that the reader may not be at a loss to judge whether or no my elucubrations are worth his reading. For all of Ben's cleverness, there's a striking similarity between the first 2 paragraphs ever published by Silence Dogood and Checkley's introduction in the first paper of the Courant. They're both modeled after Joseph Addison's first issue of The Spectator. Benjamin was clearly influenced by his brother's taste, and yet a remarkable maturity for his age. Comparing his intro to the 43-year-old Checkley, both use humor as a device, and each situates himself within a broader intellectual world. They're conscious of their reader's judgment, mentioning age, learning, and social station. And both introductions aim to legitimize their place in print, asking readers to take them seriously enough to keep reading. Yet the differences are there too. Where Checkley is flamboyant and eager to display learning, Benjamin is ironic, understated, and critical of the miscarriage of justice. Where Checkley seeks to establish his right to join the intellectuals of the age, Benjamin challenges the institutions that have trained the intellectuals. As Checkley flaunts himself so he might be taken more seriously, Benjamin is undermining the entire exercise, ironically with Checkley's self-proclaimed wits of the age. Benjamin's humor, in a certain sense, would also begin to develop. In that same first article, Silence would describe herself focusing on her birth and the death of her father, which happened on the same day, stating, "And thus was my disconsolate mother, and once made both a parent and a widow," and then proceeding to talk about her master, the country minister, stating, "He endeavored that I might be instructed in all that knowledge and learning which is necessary for our sex, and denied me no accomplishment that could possibly be attained." Benjamin advocated for more equal education opportunities, in this case for women. He himself, unable to afford to go to Harvard, felt strongly about this issue, and he would ridicule Harvard graduates in a future Silence essay, or pretending he was in a dream. I reflected in my mind on the extreme folly of those parents who, blind to their children's dullness and insensible of the solidity of their skulls, because they think their purses can afford it, will needs send them to the temple of learning, where for want of a suitable genius, they learn little more than how to carry themselves handsomely and enter a room genteelly, which might as well be acquired at a dancing school. And from whence they return, after abundance of trouble and charge, as great blockheads as ever, only more proud and self-conceited. To him, Clericus, I related my dream with all its particulars, and he, without much study, presently interpreted it, assuring me that it was a lively representation of Harvard College. Ironically, the name Silence Dogood came from Boniface, Essays to Do Good by Cotton Mather, which instructed Christians on how they could do genuine good for people over a long-term period, a book Benjamin would later state influenced him greatly. On June 11, 1722, Silence Dogood would make the front page of the Courant. In her article, she would mock the large hoop petticoats that women would have to wear as a dress, stating, "These monstrous topsy-turvy mortar pieces are neither fit for the church, the hall of the kitchen, and if a number of them were well mounted on Noddle's Island, they would look more like engines of war from bombarding the town than ornaments of the fair sex." Prior to mocking the dresses, Franklin would speak on pride, going on to say something more prophetic. "Among the many reigning vices of the town, there is none which I am more inclined to expose than that of pride. It is acknowledged by all to be a vice the most hateful to God and man. Pride goeth before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. And I remember my late reverend husband would often say upon this text that a fall was the natural consequence as well as punishment of pride." Further down in this issue of the paper, under the Foreign Affairs section, James Franklin would write, "We hear that the pirates have said they are resolved to take a Rhode Island sloop for their own use, the vessel they are in being a dull sailer. We are advised from Boston that the government of the Massachusetts are fitting out a ship to go after the pirates, to be commanded by Captain Peter Papillon, and 'tis thought we will sail sometime this month if wind and weather permit." It was this anecdote about pirates that the Massachusetts Council didn't appreciate, along with an earlier mention of Rhode Island responding to the same situation faster. Upon reviewing the paper, James Franklin was ordered before the governor and his council, who wished to know where the report came from. James refused to answer, and the council would later charge he treated them with indiscretion and indecency. Later that afternoon, on June 12th, the three judges on the governor's council ordered James's arrest. While in prison, 16-year-old Benjamin Franklin would be in charge of publishing the New England Courant.